How good of a job is Joe Douglas doing? Was the trade up for Alijah Vera-Tucker worth it? What's going to happen with Denzel Mims? All of this and more on today's mailbag edition of the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Wednesday, October 12th, 2022, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com, thanking you for making this show your first listen or first watch every day. This show is free, and it's available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you like what you see or hear, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening. You'll never miss an episode. And if you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps the channel out, and it helps other Jets fans find the podcast. This podcast is sponsored by BetterHelp. It's not a crisis line. It's not self-help. It's professional therapy done securely online, available to people worldwide. And they have a special offer for my listeners. Get 10% off your first month at betterhelp.com/lockedon. Today we have our weekly mailbag show. Thanks to everybody who sent in questions. Each Wednesday we try and do our mailbag. We begin our first questions about Joe Douglas. John, it seems like Joe Douglas has been criticized every breath he's taken as Jets general manager since his hire, but he's maybe the only positive thing Adam Gase was involved in. He's modeling this team after the Ravens organization, drafting smart, trading away pieces at the perfect time, and not breaking the bank on free agents. Yes, there have been some missteps, but JD has done the impossible and made Jets football relevant again. Can we all agree that this guy knows football? It's too early to say for sure whether Joe Douglas is the right general manager for the Jets. But from where we sit right now, at 3-2, not only at 3-2, but at 3-2 with so many of his recent draft picks playing well, I think you have to be optimistic with the direction of the franchise. Joe Douglas has a plan. I mean, listen, part of the thing that helps Joe Douglas is that he's following the easiest act a GM could ever follow. Because after Mike Maccagnan, just by having a plan, Joe Douglas comes off looking really good. Joe Douglas comes off looking like a Hall of Fame GM. After anybody, I think like any competent GM would look like a Hall of Famer following Mike Maccagnan, who was one of the worst GMs in this century in the NFL. And he followed John Idzik, who had a very unsuccessful 2-year run. So he's following a very easy act. In fact, I'd say find the Mike Maccagnan and John Idzik in whatever profession you belong to and follow them, take the job after them, and you'll look like a genius. And I say that with trepidation because I know somebody's going to make the joke, well, I can't wait to follow John as the next host of Locked On Jets because he's the Mike Maccagnan and John is, yeah, good joke. You look at the various areas, there's been some good and some bad with Joe Douglas. Free agency he's been bad in. The 3 years he's run free agency, there have not been many good signings. There have been a couple. Connor McGovern was good. I guess George Fant worked for a year. DJ Reed looks like a tremendous signing this past offseason. Outside of that, and there have been some really bad signings. You look at the trades he's made, he's gotten good value. He's showed a lot of discipline in trades. And he's also shown discipline in free agency. He's been a big spender, and most of them have not worked out. But at least you don't have the cap-destroying contracts of like a C.J. Mosley or Trumaine Johnson. Even though Joe Douglas spends a lot of money in free agency, he's not setting the market. He's not handing out blank checks, and that's a good thing because those contracts can destroy you. The draft, though, that's really where GMs make it or break it. And the first draft, 2020, looks awful. 21 looks pretty good right now. And 22, we're only 5 games in. But you have to say it looks like perhaps a franchise-changing draft from the impact the Jets are getting from this class through 5 games. Only 5 games, a lot of time to go, but you have to be excited with that. Discipline in trades, and beyond discipline in trades, stockpiling draft picks. I don't think, I listed those 3 drafts. One was bad, one looks pretty good, one looks great. It's not an accident that the amount of draft capital the Jets had in these drafts is proportional to the quality. The more picks you have, the more opportunities you have to hit. And Joe Douglas acquired these picks by showing discipline in trades, getting 2 first-rounders for Jamal Adams, getting a second-rounder for Sam Darnold, and a 4th-rounder at a point where really sounds like Carolina was the only bidder. It sounds like Joe Douglas got the Panthers to bid against themselves. There's a lot that's unknown about Joe Douglas, and a lot of it's going to come down to his handpicked quarterback, Zach Wilson, and his handpicked head coach, Robert Saleh. And if both of those fail, it may not last for Joe Douglas. Some of his other moves on the pro personnel side, I mean, he's made some good trades. People point to the Darnold trade. They point to the Adams trade. For whatever reason, people love the Blake Cashman trade, getting a 6th-round pick for Blake Cashman. Well, you want to praise the Blake Cashman trade. Joe Douglas did also give a 6th-round pick for Nate Hairston. Gave up a day 3 pick for Joe Flacco. So, some of the trades for players have not been so great, but he's extracted great value when he's traded a player for picks. All in all, I think it looks pretty good. Now, is it a case where he's done the impossible? Well, this is not the impossible. The Jets have had good teams in the past. The Jets were in the AFC Championship game 2 straight years in 2009 and 2010. So, building the Jets into a competitive team, let's not make it into impossible. And they had the same ownership then. But he's done a good job. He's actually displayed vision. He's displayed he's got a plan. And he's got discipline. And vision, plan, and discipline, they do not guarantee success. But a lack of these things, almost like Mike McCagnon had, almost certainly guarantees failure. Joe Douglas is competent. That's what I'll say. I feel pretty confident to say Joe Douglas is a competent GM. I think the Jets are done being the bottom of the league. I think the Jets are done being the laughingstock worst team in the league. Bottom barrel team. I think that's over. The question is, how high do you get from here? Because the easiest step, and maybe it does not seem so easy because the Jets have failed to do it, the easiest step is getting out of the absolute basement. Are you going to be mediocre? Are you going to be a consistent playoff team? Or are you eventually going to turn into a contender? That's what's unknown right now. Listen, Joe Douglas is the first competent GM the Jets have had since Mike Tannenbaum. That's a fair statement. Joe Douglas knows football, yes. How much better will the Jets get? I don't know. But for the time being, listen, there's no question the Jets are improved. And there's no question there are some really exciting young players on this roster. So hopefully it all works out. Listen, Joe Douglas came in with enough hype. Maybe the most hyped GM hire since Chris Ballard was hired by the Colts years ago. Universally acclaimed. So far there's been some bad, but we're starting to see some of the good, and we're starting to see some of the long-term vision pay dividends. Our next question, wouldn't it be better if each head coach had one challenge of a penalty call, such as roughing the passer or pass interference per game? Almost every head coach challenge as it stands now involves second-guessing some determination made by the referee, such as whether a receiver gets 2 feet in bounds and or whether a runner fumbles before contact with the ground. Why not extend the challenge to important and sometimes game-changing referee determinations like pass interference and roughing the passer? Well, you may remember they tried to do it a couple years ago with pass interference after the disaster in the 2017 NFC Championship game between the 2018 NFC Championship game between the Saints and the Rams, an egregious blown call on a game-deciding pass interference penalty. And it did not work the next year. They got to the point where officials were so afraid of overturning calls that by the end of the year they were overturning almost none of the pass interference calls. The answer, I think, is pretty clear. And I've actually seen this suggested on various sites over the last couple of days. The Alliance of American Football, you may remember that league that existed for less than one season a couple of years back. They came up with this idea, the Sky Judge. That was essentially a referee who was not on the field. I guess he was in a booth. But he essentially watched all the replays at the end of a play. And if the officials got something wrong, he just told them, hey, you got this wrong, change the call. Doesn't that seem logical? That seems like the most... And, it helped the flow of the game because you did not need to stop play every time so the official could go over and, check a play. Just do it in real time. A lot of these calls are so obvious that, you can see it on the first replay. Isn't that a more logical approach than, extending the challenge system even further? That's what I think. But I guess it makes too much sense for the NFL. But that idea, that came out of a new league, and that shows you why you should root for these upstart leagues to succeed, because they bring new thinking to the game. Even leagues like the old XFL in 2001, they brought innovations to the NFL. I mean, some of the camera angles you take for granted now in NFL games originally originated in the XFL. The NFL is not really a league of forward thinking, so it's always good when there's some competition. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we're going to talk about a wide receiver who's frequently discussed, but has yet to suit up this year. What's going to happen with Denzel Mims? We'll continue the discussion on this Wednesday mailbag episode. Now a word from our sponsor, BetterHelp. Over the last couple of years, it's become more and more clear how important taking care of your mental health is. We try and take care of our physical health by eating well, going to the doctor, but taking care of your mind is just as important. And there are many different ways we can go about it. You can try meditation, but therapy is also something worth considering. If you're thinking about giving therapy a try, BetterHelp is a great option. It's convenient, accessible, affordable, and entirely online. You can get matched with a therapist after filling out a brief survey, and you can switch therapists anytime. When you want to be a better problem solver, therapy can get you there. Visit betterhelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. Again, that's BetterHelp. It's BetterHelp.com/lockedon, LOCKEDON. BetterHelp.com/lockedon. Thank you again for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. This show's free and it's available on all platforms, including YouTube. We continue with our weekly mailbag. John, what can we reasonably expect for Denzel Mims in the trade market? And do you expect him to be gone by the trade deadline? Well, the story that came out of multiple places before the end of the preseason, and you have to remember Denzel Mims asked for a trade at the end of the preseason, was that the Jets were asking for a fourth-round pick. And no team was willing to give that up. So what does that tell you? I mean, to me, it says that Denzel Mims really does not have much of a trade market in this league. And is that going to change? I mean, the thing is, if you thought Denzel Mims is a quality starter at the receiver position, a fourth-round pick's really not that big of a price. So, maybe some teams are a little bit more desperate now than they were at the beginning of the season. Maybe somebody suffers an injury between now and the deadline. But here's the problem. If you did not think Mims was good enough to give up a fourth at the start of the season, why would you now, after he's been inactive for every game so far from the Jets? I don't know if it's going to happen. I think the Jets view him as a backup. There's this great debate on Mims about whether he's an actual starter who can make an impact or whether he can give you nothing. And I kind of lean more on the side of he's not going to give you a whole lot. But there's a middle ground. Maybe the Jets just view him as a quality backup. And that kind of matches with the idea that they want to trade him for a fourth-round pick. Because depth is important in this league. So if you think you got a guy who's a good backup, you're not just going to give him away for anything. But if you get something substantive in return that can help your team down the line, a depth player maybe not something you hold on to. So I think it's a tough spot. My guess is probably not. I mean, I know the idea they're going to hold him and some team's going to suffer an injury. But any team that gets desperate because of an injury, they probably were not great at receiver to begin with. If one injury changes everything, that shows you probably could have used a quality player before the start of the season. And if you were not willing to give that up for Mims then, now after all these weeks where he's been inactive, and I really disagreed with the idea that, that preseason game against the Giants was going to dramatically alter perceptions around him because, I think you have your view on Denzel Mims based on what he's done so far in the league. And him, putting up big numbers against backups and third teamers, I just did not think it was going to change a whole lot. So I would have to guess that Denzel Mims is going to remain a Jet. Maybe he gets his opportunity. I know he's not happy about it because his agent asked for a trade before the start of the season. I just think it's a tough spot for Mims. Next question. Quan Alexander has seemed to have a really good season. What are your thoughts on his play, and do you keep Quincy Williams on the bench even when he is healthy in favor of Quan? I think he's playing well. I have to be honest, I'm impressed by Quan Alexander, and I've never been a big Quan Alexander guy. I remember going back to that 2019 offseason. Very easy to forget this, but before the Jets signed C.J. Mosley, they went hard after Quan Alexander and Mike McCagnon's last free agency. C.J. Mosley was actually plan B at the linebacker position. The Jets really wanted Quan Alexander, and he signed with San Francisco and Robert Saleh. He's been a really big addition. I mean, the Jets, we know they have shaky linebacker play, but Alexander's at least solidified one spot. He's been excellent against the run. He's had some good moments in coverage. And yes, I would keep him in the lineup. I think he's played better than Quincy Williams. I don't think Quincy Williams has taken a step forward at all this year when he's been in the lineup. And that's a big deal because in today's NFL, offenses are putting three receivers on the field. So that means you're in nickel most of the time. And when the Jets are in nickel, they're mostly playing a 4-2-5. So the difference between being the second linebacker and third linebacker is big. Third linebacker is a situational player for the Jets. Second linebacker is a guy who never leaves the field. And I think based on the performances so far, it should be Quan Alexander. Whether that will happen, I don't know. Next question. If you were to select one jersey to buy with your own money from each of Joe Douglas's draft class, which player would you purchase? If you were allowed a full refund on any one jersey purchased, who would it be and why? Okay, so 2020, I guess I have to go with Braden Mann because he's actually the one guy contributing to the Jets this year. He's playing pretty well, so I guess he's the guy. If I have to give one back, it's Denzel Mims. I mean, you could give back almost any of the jerseys, but Mims was my guy in that draft. You go back to those podcasts prior to 2020 and after the Jets drafted him, I thought he was going to be amazing. I thought he was going to be a star. He's let me down so much. So Denzel Mims is my guy I'm giving back in 2020. 2021, Alijah Vera-Tucker is the guy I'm buying. I'm buying the Alijah Vera-Tucker jersey. You got to love this guy. He just goes to a new position every week and dominates. How can you not love an offensive lineman like that? So that's the guy I'm buying. Giving back Hamza Nasruddin because he got a lot of hype as a late round pick. He was a guy that they thought could fill in at linebacker. There's all this buzz about how he was going to be an early round pick before he got hurt. And it really has just not come together for him. In 2022, Breece Hall was my guy, so I guess I got to go with his jersey. Breece Hall is the jersey I'm buying. I'm not giving back any jersey yet, but if I have to give one back, I guess it has to be Jeremy Ruckert because he's really the only member of the rookie class who's not contributing in any way. So I guess I don't feel good about that because I still think Ruckert has a shot to contribute going forward. But look, he's on a team with two tight ends who are doing nothing and still can't get on the field. So I guess Ruckert's my guy there. Now ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we're going to talk more about recent drafts. Was it right to trade it for Alijah Vera-Tucker? Tough to believe it's still a question, yet it's still being asked. We'll talk about it more as we continue on this Wednesday mailbag episode. It's tough to believe based on what happened last weekend, with the Jets having a big win against Miami, getting their second straight victory, and the Packers losing to the Giants in London, and then needing to play after the trip back from London. However, Green Bay is a 7-point favorite against the Jets this week. And that shows you bettors, the line makers, they're focused on their preconceptions of these teams because I don't think there's any way the Jets would be 7-point underdogs to Green Bay based on what we've seen this year and especially recently. But if you feel strongly enough that you want to put money down on that game, BetOnline is your spot. It's your number one source for football betting info this season. You can find all the latest player developments, team matchups, news, podcasts, and in-depth articles, along with analysis on every game you can find. And as always, BetOnline remains your continued source for all of the sports wagering information, with live betting and up-to-the-minute scores for every sports out there. It's the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your favorite games and events. That includes the NFL, but it also includes baseball, MMA, boxing, golf, and the NHL. Head to betonline.net today or use your mobile device to learn more. BetOnline, where the game starts. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Mailbag Wednesday. Our next question. Over the last month, I've had a lot of consternation about the Jets' offensive line. Alijah Vera-Tucker is a great player. I'm not taking anything away from him, but I was opposed to trading up for him in 2021 because of the opportunity cost. I thought the Jets should have used their picks to try and raise the team's talent floor rather than trying to find a generational guard. Christian Darrisaw ended up being on the board at 23, although there's no guarantee he still would have been there had the Jets not made the trade. For the sake of argument, let's assume he still would have been there. Darrisaw appears to be a great player, and now the Jets had to move our AVT to right tackle anyway. With the 2 third-round picks, the Jets could have taken a couple of swings at the guard position. Quinn Myers seems to be a hit, and Wyatt Davis seems to be a miss, were available at the time. By my count, the Jets have only drafted 6 offensive linemen since 2016, when they drafted Brandon Shell. By comparison, since 2016, the Patriots have drafted 13 offensive linemen, the Dolphins 9, and the Bills 7. I guess my point is that the Jets should take more bites at the apple rather than trading away picks to move up the draft board. Curious about your thoughts. So there's a lot to unpack there. I think in general, you should trade down more than you trade up for that reason. More bites at the apple. Draft is an inexact science. The greatest draft minds, bat under 500. The more chances you have, and the numbers all back this up if you look through history. But there are moments, and sometimes it's always the balance. Sometimes you just have to trust your board. Teams fall too far on the side of trusting their board in the NFL in general. They're too aggressive. But there are times where you have to pick your spots. I did not have an issue with the trade for Alijah Vera-Tucker because offensive line is at a premium in the NFL today. The Jets had a great need at the time. They needed to solidify their offensive line because they had just drafted Zach Wilson. So, and the other aspect of this is they also had excess draft capital. So even though they traded up, even though they gave up a number of picks, they still left the draft with more swings at the bat than they gave up, than they entered with. So with all this in mind, I think occasionally a well-timed trade up can work wonders for your team. I think it's difficult to complain about what Alijah Vera-Tucker's done this year. Now, can you come up with a scenario where maybe the Jets would have been better off than what actually happened? Sure. You could come up with a scenario where they get Darisaw and they fill the guard position in the third round. Here's the thing. There's no guarantee that would have happened. And I think just because this was not the number one best possible outcome, that doesn't make it a bad outcome. I think you have to be happy at some point. Even if you don't get the absolute best, most sterling outcome, that doesn't mean you've done badly. You can't complain when you get... If Alijah Vera-Tucker continues developing like this, the trade's going to be worth it, no matter what the Jets could have had. Yeah, you could always do better, but I think back to... This is not this is an extreme example, but in 2004, would the Giants have been better off, just keeping Phillip Rivers rather than trading up for Eli Manning? Yeah, probably. Do you think anybody cares about that? Of course not. Because the outcome they got was really good. So, sometimes you can do a lot worse in the draft. The Jets have done a lot worse. It's hard to hit. If you get a hit, don't overthink it. There's always a better possible outcome in the draft, in life, but you just have to be happy if you did okay. And I think the Jets did better than okay. So I can't complain about it. I understand the point, and listen, the Jets should not make it part of their draft approach to constantly trade up. I think the trade ups need to end this year when they're back to a regular assortment of picks. Last 2 years, I've not had an issue because of the players they traded up for, one, and also because they began from a position where they had extra picks. I do think they need to scale back the trade ups for just that reason, but I don't really have a big problem with it. I think it's fine. And our last question, where did the Jets get Nate Herbig from? Well, he was a waiver claim from the Eagles. And, earlier in the show, I talked about Joe Douglas' struggles in free agency. Joe Douglas' weakest part of his job so far with the Jets has been what's known as the pro personnel side. And that's essentially acquiring players from other teams. He's not been great in free agency. He's not been great in trades. I went through the list. Nate Hairston, Joe Flacco. You want to go back, Shaq Lawson, which kind of made sense at the time. Alex Lewis. I mean, there just have not been many good trades for players Joe Douglas has made. The one exception is the waiver wire. Joe Douglas has found a number of quality players off waivers. He found John Franklin Myers off waivers. He got Braxton Berrios, Quincy Williams, who I know is not having a great year, but still for a waiver claim has been excellent. You don't build your team through waivers. It's really a mechanism to get depth. As teams cut players, so many of them go onto waivers, so you have a chance to grab them. Joe Douglas has been really good with that, and that's probably the one aspect of pro personnel he's been good. There have been other areas where he's been good when you're talking about planning, discipline, the draft, recent drafts, but that's really the only area he's succeeded is the waiver wire when it comes to the pro personnel side. But he's done, it's one of those things that helps your team build your team depth, and occasionally you get a good starter out of it. So, Joe Douglas is doing the job there. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, give it a 5-star review. If you're listening on a podcast source, please hit the subscribe button as well, and give the show a thumbs up if you're watching on YouTube. Have a great Wednesday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets. It's Crossover Thursday with Peter Bukowski of Locked On Packers.